I was born in my grandmother's boarding house, so it was a kind of odd start, but it was the 1930s, and Depression era was just setting in. And my parents were college dropouts, both of them, and hard to find jobs. And my dad would get a traveling job now and then. Mother would go with him. So my grandmother had a lot to do with my early, storytelling, among other things. She did this often by way of an album of photographs she took when she went west with a friend and came back and so on, just pictures. But she would tell stories about them. So I got kind of the idea that old people told stories like this. And I was taught to read early on, and my parents, neither of them were literary people, though my mother was quite a good reader. But it was not exactly a place that fostered thoughts about writing. So in many ways, that early storytelling of my grandmother, while she was in effect babysitting me while my parents were off, had a kind of genetic influence, you might say, almost that way. And as time went on, I got asked by Esquire sometime about the major influence, and I said, well, learning to read was the main influence on me. So as soon as I began to catch on to that, I would read what I could read, and still very limited, this Northwest Iowa home, and not really thinking literature in any way, and it was just a kind of hobby, you might say, a little bit, to look at a book. Then we moved, my father got a job finally in newspapers, and we moved, and being in newspapers already stimulated the idea of reading. And I spent a lot of time turning up at the local library. And so in a way, the librarian was the one who was setting my reading patterns thereafter, much more than my parents. And she would recommend, as soon as I was old enough to understand, she would give me pretty difficult, pretty adult books. So I was reading bestsellers of the time when I was like 12 or 13. Before that, I created a family newspaper. And my father was doing a newspaper now, and I wanted to do the newspapers too, and so I made one which I had all the kind of little typical features that a newspaper would have, all written by hand. And I did cartoons. I was something of a caricaturist and a very minor scale artist. And so I would do these little comic strips and so on, create a kind of continuity, and write little stories sometimes just about something that I had read. And then in high school, by the time I reached that point, I was working for the school paper, and our school burned down. And this is in southern Illinois. And I got my father to agree to let me we went around to classes in different public buildings, or Elks Club, I remember, was one location for a class. And went around visiting those places, but I got my father to agree to set a page aside each week for the newspaper, the high school newspaper. And it was hard to fill. It was quite a bit of space there, and it was kind of silly things that high school newspapers are full of. Ball games and little episodes that happened in the school. And so I started filling the space with little stories. They were generally takeoffs, not surprisingly given what I've gone on doing, on fairy tales. And so I sometimes, really embarrassingly, people like Shakespeare, the plots. And those kind of filled in the empty spaces that I had to fill in the paper. So I didn't have any imagination what this would amount to, and I wasn't, although I was reading quite a lot, I wasn't aware of anything. I wasn't aware of there was a tradition, didn't know what literature was as such. And I was not guided, and I didn't have teachers who said you should be reading such and such. It was just hit and miss. And the magazines that came through the door or that I ran into somewhere would, if I was a story in it, I might want to try to imitate that kind of story writing, but I didn't have any clear objective. And it was in college then that I encountered a possibility of a class, took the class, poorly taught, but I began thinking about how to write a story, and I wrote that story about a coal mining town disaster. One of the things I had done as a young newspaper reporter for my father's paper was cover a very big mine disaster, and did a lot of the gopher stuff, but that was good. I was everywhere. And so I wrote a story that kind of used that as a setting. And that story eventually, after several rewrites, got published in Saul Bellows' magazine, Noble Savage, and from there, Origin of Brunists and so on. So I think the experience I had was very accidental. I didn't have any literary person around that would tell me you should be reading such and such. And I didn't have any writer I admired that I looked up to particularly. They were just all a bunch of people who wrote books, and I read their books. It wasn't really until I kind of escaped from that small town milieu that and even after, really, I needed to graduate from college before I did this, that I at last had a glimmering of what writing could or should be. And this came from reading Samuel Beckett and Franz Kafka and so on. This was a moment when it was a waking up time, but it came late. I was in the Navy. I was graduated from college already. It was when I began to stop thinking about the Saturday Evening Post and start thinking about the vocation of writing. And it was a very critical moment for me. And in fact, as I got out of the Navy, that's when I rented this little cabin up in Minnesota on Lake Rainy Lake, and isolated myself and just thought my way through the whole thing. And since then, I've really just been a continuation of that moment. But it wasn't a moment that was prepared for. All was accident along the way. And my mother understood to some degree what I was doing. My father never did. I showed him a story, and he said, "What is this, some kind of whodunit?" Because he couldn't figure it out at all. And the friends I had were mostly, there were a lot of academic types, but there were no really literary types. But a couple then became a couple of friends did become involved in literature, and I became involved, had been involved with them. So I began to understand through them some things too. But in a way, it was the principle I often tell my students, and that is, write first and read after. It doesn't. The opposite is often taught to them, that they should do a lot of reading so they understand what they're up to. But I think the more important thing is to keep writing, and that if you have this as a kind of habit, then when you read a book, you think about it in a different way. And you should never trust what you write, but you should always, find your own way that way. So it was not but incidentally, I later learned that this was sort of Jack Barth's beginning as well. And to some extent, Bill Gaddis. I mean, a lot of the postmodernists had this kind of non-literature, but still writing way from early on, and finding their own way and then discovering their own way to do things. Nobody taught them, which is probably basically a good thing. When students ask me about going on to writing, get an MFA somewhere, I say, no, don't do it. If you have to, if you haven't any other way to support yourself, fine, but it's not a good idea, basically. And most writing schools teach students the wrong thing anyway. So, those kinds of origins, which led me to just keep having to make it up myself. I had to think about what it was I was doing, why I was doing it. And the people that helped, I never knew them. Samuel Beckett was the most important influence on me in that regard, where I came to understand writing not as a profession or as a way to make money or something, but as a vocation, almost a priestly vocation. And it's what he certainly had. And it seemed like an ideal that I could strive for. And doing it, I mean, nothing I write is really Beckettian, but the impulse to do what I do is his. It's shared with him.